The wind carried the smell of ash and frozen pine that evening, whispering through the hollow bones of the valley. Silas Ward sat alone at his table, a half-burned lantern bleeding weak light across his hands. Outside, the horizon bruised purple, the last breath of day sliding behind the hills. He'd eaten nothing but coffee and bread for 2 days, though the shelves weren't empty, just his heart was. The house, too, felt like a tomb that refused to admit its dead. Then came the sound, a knock, soft but certain. 3 beats, then a pause, then one more as if from hands too frail to finish. Silas froze. Strangers didn't wander to the far edge of Rattler Creek after dusk. He stood slowly, the floorboards groaning beneath his boots, and opened the door. 2 women stood there in the dying light, snow tangled in their hair, each clutching a swaddled bundle against her chest. One had skin like moonlight turned to porcelain, eyes slanted, wide, and trembling. The other's face was wind-burned bronze, high-boned, proud, and tired. The Chinese woman's lips moved first. "We have not eaten for 5 days," she whispered, voice cracking like thin ice. The Apache woman added in broken English, "Please, for the babies." The sight hit Silas like a memory he'd buried beneath whiskey and work, the night his wife had labored through winter storms only to deliver silence. He had heard that same small cry once, and then never again. Something inside him, something he thought was dead, stirred awake. He looked past them to the dark road. No wagon, no man. Only 2 mothers and the sound of their children's faint breathing. "You're a long way from any town," he said quietly. They nodded, eyes down, ashamed of existing. Shame was something Silas understood too well. He stepped aside without another word. They hesitated, afraid of rejection hidden behind courtesy. But when the warmth of his house brushed their faces, both women crossed the threshold as if stepping into another life. Inside, the fire had nearly gone out. Silas knelt, added kindling, and coaxed the flame alive. Its glow painted the women in trembling gold, the Chinese mother's pale cheek hollowed by hunger, the Apache's hands raw and bleeding from wind. The babies whimpered, the sound thin and desperate. Silas reached for the kettle. "Water first," he said. "Then bread." They obeyed as if he were a sheriff instead of a widower. When the warm tin cups touched their lips, both women exhaled small sighs, barely human, almost animal in relief. He handed them slices of bread, and though the crumbs stuck to their cracked lips, they ate like people tasting hope again. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was heavy with words none of them could afford. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin, scouring the valley. The fire popped. Sparks flared like stars dying one by one. The Chinese woman adjusted her baby's wrap and whispered something soft in a language Silas couldn't understand. The Apache woman watched the flames, her face unreadable, eyes reflecting the orange light like a wary animal's. Silas spoke, not looking at them. "There's a shed out back. You can sleep there tonight." He hesitated, hearing the harshness in his own voice. "It's warmer than the wind." The women nodded. But when the Chinese mother tried to stand, her knees buckled. The Apache woman caught her arm. Silas moved before he could think, catching the baby before it fell. The infant was light as a loaf of air, face flushed from cold. He'd forgotten how small a heartbeat could feel through a blanket. He held the child too long, unable to set it down. The Chinese mother's eyes lifted, glistening. "Thank you," she said. The words were fragile, but sincere. Silas gave the baby back, suddenly aware of how rough his hands were. "Stay by the fire," he murmured. "I'll bring blankets." When he returned, both women had dozed upright, exhaustion heavier than fear. The babies slept against them, 2 small islands of peace amid ruin. He spread a quilt over their shoulders. The scent of milk and pine filled the room. Something inside his chest eased, a quiet loosening he hadn't felt since before the funeral bells rang for his wife. He sat back in his chair, watching them as the storm thickened outside. The lantern flickered, dimmed, then steadied again. Through the crackle of wood, he could hear one of the babies breathing fast, shallow, like it was afraid to stop. The mothers' faces were different as dawn and dusk, yet both carried the same hunger, the will to live. It humbled him. Hours slipped like smoke. He almost drifted to sleep when a low groan of timber startled him. He rose, stepped to the window, and saw the snow deepening fast. Tomorrow would bring trouble. Strangers sheltering under a white man's roof never passed unnoticed. Rattler Creek had long memories and short mercy. The thought stirred unease, but then he looked back at the hearth and saw the women again, fragile but still there. The unease melted. When dawn came pale and weak, Silas brewed coffee and left a plate of biscuits near them. The Chinese woman stirred first, her eyes darting as if expecting to be driven out. Instead, Silas said, "Eat." The Apache woman's hand trembled when she reached for one. She tore it in half and fed the smaller piece to the Chinese woman before taking her own bite. They shared even hunger. Outside, the valley gleamed white. Silence pressed against the windows. The rancher watched them eat, then cleared his throat. "You can stay the night again," he said softly. He meant only to speak once, but his voice caught. "There's plenty of work to do here." Neither woman replied. The Chinese mother's eyes welled, but she blinked the tears back, refusing pity. The Apache woman lifted her chin, a flicker of pride in her stillness. The babies slept on, full bellies at last. Silas turned away, hiding the faint smile threatening to break his weathered face. Something unseen had shifted, the smallest crack in the stone wall around his heart. He didn't yet know whose presence had done it, the proud Apache with eyes like storm clouds or the quiet Chinese girl whose voice trembled with kindness, but he knew his home no longer felt like a grave. Outside, the snow eased. The wind paused, listening. From somewhere distant came a single raven's cry, echoing over the frozen plain. Silas glanced toward the horizon, uneasy without knowing why. The world beyond his porch still held its cruelty. Gossip traveled faster than mercy. He knew before long someone would ride up that road asking questions about the strangers under his roof. But for now, as the fire whispered and two mothers breathed in unison beside their sleeping newborns, Silas let the world wait. He closed the door against the cold, the latch clicking like a promise. And behind that quiet sound, something ancient in him, something aching and alive, took its first deep breath. The snow had begun to melt by the third day, leaving behind a wet shine that turned the dirt road into mirrors of sky. Silas Ward rode into town that morning, coat collar up, hat low. The horse's hooves beat a dull rhythm through the slush, steady, patient, unaware that every echo carried rumor behind it. People in Rattler Creek didn't need much to start talking, and Silas, for the first time in years, had given them a feast. He tied his horse near the mercantile, feeling eyes prick his back before he ever stepped inside. Mrs. Ardell stood at the porch rail of her boarding house, hands folded, lips curved sharp as a hatchet. "So it's true," she called, voice high and shrill as a jaybird. "Two heathen women under your roof? Lord have mercy, Silas Ward. You'll be cursed before spring planting." Silas didn't stop walking. He pushed through the door of the mercantile, but the warmth inside didn't reach him. Boone Clay, the sheriff, was there by the counter, leaning over a barrel of flour. He straightened when he saw Silas. "Morning," Boone said cautiously. "Heard you got company out there." Silas met his eyes, steady and unreadable. "They're hungry. That's all." Boone scratched his beard. "Town doesn't see it that way. Folks around here ain't exactly used to seeing Apaches and Chinese women treated like equals. You watch yourself. Mercy gets twisted quick when pride feels threatened." Silas said nothing, just laid coin on the counter for coffee beans, sugar, and rice. Boone sighed. "I ain't telling you what to do. Just, don't let their hate make you cruel." Outside, Mrs. Ardell's voice followed him down the boardwalk. "He's lost his mind, that one. Bringing trouble into decent land." Another man spat in the snow and muttered, "Ought to send the sheriff to fetch him out." But no one came near him. They only watched as he mounted his horse and rode away through the whispering pines. Back at the ranch, the sound of laughter, small, uncertain, met him before the door did. It startled him. Mei Lien sat by the hearth, her baby propped on her knee, humming in a lilting, foreign tone. Atsalee was mending a bridle strap with quiet concentration, her fingers moving like she was weaving sunlight into leather. Both looked up when Silas entered, and the room seemed to breathe. He set the sack of supplies on the table. "Town's already talking," he said. His voice was calm, but his jaw worked tight. Mei Lian's smile faltered. "We can leave," she said quickly. "We not want trouble." Her English bent under the weight of fear. Atsuli's eyes hardened. "They always talk. Talk doesn't kill. Hunger does." Silas met her gaze. There was no softness in it, only truth. He nodded once. "You stay," he said. "Let them talk." Through the next days, life took on a rhythm neither strange nor familiar. Silas repaired fences. Atsuli carried feed to the horses, moving with the precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime surviving. Mei Lian cooked small meals, rice stretched thin with beans, biscuits golden though she burned them once and nearly cried. Silas said nothing, just ate them anyway. She caught him hiding the worst of the char under his plate and smiled in secret. The babies filled the quiet with tiny noises, coos, hiccups, soft cries that turned nights into slow hymns. Sometimes Silas woke before dawn to the sound of Mei Lian whispering lullabies, her voice a trembling thread of comfort through the dark. Once, he found her asleep by the fire, her child in her arms, the warmth painting her cheeks with color. He paused, watching. She looked fragile as snow, but alive. He turned away before his heart gave itself permission to feel. Atsuli saw it all. She said nothing, but her glances carried knowing, half amusement, half warning. At times, she'd speak to him briefly, in that clipped, quiet tone that made every word count. "You look at her like a man looking for forgiveness," she said once while stacking firewood. Silas almost dropped the axe. "I ain't looking for anything." She smiled faintly. "Maybe not. But she's looking back." In town, the whispers swelled like thunderclouds. Children were told not to ride near Ward Ranch. Mrs. Ardell claimed she saw smoke at midnight and swore it was witchcraft. Boone came by one afternoon, hat in hand. "You got to understand, Silas, this won't end kindly. Folks can't stand what they don't own." Silas leaned on the doorframe, eyes cold. "They're not property. They're guests." Boone's shoulders sagged. "You always were stubborn as the hills." After the sheriff left, the silence between Silas and the women grew heavier, but not empty. It was the kind of quiet where hearts spoke louder than tongues. Mei Lian began tending the garden out back, turning over frozen soil with bare hands. Silas joined her, handing her gloves she refused to wear. "Can't feel life through cloth," she said simply. He didn't understand her words, but he understood the way she said them. Soft, steady, true. That evening, as the last light bled across the plains, Silas caught sight of her reflection in the window, her hair unbound, glimmering in the orange of the fire. The sight struck him like a memory of something that had never happened. A family, laughter, a world unstained by death. He turned before she noticed, but she did. She always did. Later, he heard the babies stir. Mei Lian rose to soothe them, humming, and he found himself whispering, almost to himself, "You sing like rain." She looked up, startled, not sure if it was a compliment or something else. "Rain means life where I come from," he added quickly, his voice low. "Keep singing." She smiled faintly, shy, but didn't stop. The next morning, a note appeared under his door, folded parchment scrawled in hasty ink. "If you don't send them away, we will come ourselves." No name, just threat. Silas read it, folded it once, and fed it to the fire. The paper curled black and vanished. Behind him, Mei Lian watched silently, clutching her baby. Atsuli stepped beside her, jaw set. "They will test you," she said. "They always test kindness first." He met her gaze. "Then let them." For the first time, there was steel beneath his calm. That night, the three of them shared supper by the hearth, beans, cornbread, and the fragile warmth of something close to belonging. Outside, wolves howled beyond the ridge, their cries threading through the wind. Silas looked at the two women and their children, realizing the loneliness that had once haunted this cabin had begun to lose its voice. He didn't yet understand what was forming between them, only that it was stronger than fear and gentler than pity. Mei Lian caught his eyes once across the table and looked away, cheeks flushed. Atsuli's gaze lingered on him too, but different, like someone guarding not herself, but the balance of what was coming. When the fire dimmed and silence returned, Silas stepped out onto the porch. The valley lay hushed under starlight, beautiful and cruel. He heard the faint sound of a baby crying inside and smiled, a sound of life in a house that had forgotten what that meant. From down the hill, the glow of lanterns flickered, 3 of them, moving slow along the trail from town. He narrowed his eyes. Visitors at this hour carried nothing holy. He turned back toward the cabin, heart tightening. The whispers had found legs. The snow fell thicker than before, slow and unending, as if the sky had forgotten any other season. Winter had claimed the valley whole. Each morning began in silence. No birds, no horses calling, only the wind scraping across the eaves. Inside the cabin, warmth flickered like faith. Fragile, necessary, alive. Silas Ward moved through it as though walking in a dream, a man who no longer knew whether he was protecting the women beneath his roof or they were the ones keeping him from vanishing into the cold. Mei Lian had grown paler since the first night, though her eyes were brighter. She spent her hours beside the fire, sewing torn shirts, her baby wrapped against her chest like a heartbeat she refused to lose. Atsuli rose before dawn each day, splitting kindling in the yard with a rhythm sharp enough to keep ghosts away. Her presence filled the place with quiet strength. They were different in every way, one soft and deliberate, the other fierce and untamed, but together they shaped something unspoken between them, survival as prayer. Silas had stopped counting the days since the last letter slid under his door. He knew more would come. Trouble always did, but not yet. The ranch had found a strange peace under its shroud of snow. He spent the mornings tending to the animals, the afternoons fixing fences or repairing tools long neglected. When he returned to the cabin, steam from the pot on the stove greeted him like forgiveness. Sometimes he caught Mei Lian watching him through the haze, her lips parted slightly as if she were about to speak but chose not to. One evening, as dusk folded the world in blue, Silas found her in the stable, humming to calm the horses. Her baby slept in a basket of hay, wrapped in a blanket he'd mended himself. "They remember kindness," Mei Lian whispered, stroking the mare's neck. "Even when men forget." Silas leaned against the post, watching her fingers trace the animal's mane with reverence. "You talk to them like people," he said. She smiled faintly. "Sometimes they listen better." It was the first time he'd seen her smile fully. It changed the air around them, softened it. He wanted to ask where she'd come from, how she'd ended up wandering half-dead through a land that would never call her its own. But she turned away, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear, and he knew her silence was not distance. It was the language of endurance. He understood that well enough. Atsuli watched them from the porch. Later that night, while Silas mended a broken chair, she spoke without looking up from the fire. "Your eyes follow her," she said plainly. He looked up, startled. "I'm just making sure she's safe." "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe you think safety and love are the same thing." Her tone wasn't cruel, only old, like someone who'd lived long enough to know the difference. Days blurred. The storm thickened until even the trees vanished behind curtains of white. They survived on salt pork, potatoes, and melted snow. Mei Lian began to sing to the babies at night, her voice soft as falling ash. The songs were strange and beautiful, carrying something the others couldn't name, grief and hope woven so tightly they were the same thread. Silas started leaving small things by her place at the hearth, a wooden spoon, a spool of thread, an apple from the cellar. She never thanked him aloud, but one morning he found a bowl of rice left near his chair, perfectly cooked, steam still rising. That was her answer. Atsuli noticed, though she said nothing. She moved like a guardian, restless at the edge of warmth, as if she feared peace itself might betray them. Sometimes Silas caught her standing outside at night, scanning the dark hills. "What are you looking for?" he asked once. "Ghosts or men?" she replied. "One calls the other." He thought she was joking until he saw the flint knife she carried under her shawl. One afternoon, when the sky turned the color of bruised silver, Silas took the rifle and went to the creek. The ice was thick but creaking. Life beneath it whispered in bubbles. He spotted 2 deer across the bend, lean and uncertain. He raised his gun, then lowered it again. The idea of taking life, any life, felt heavier now that so much had returned to his home. When he came back empty-handed, Atsalee frowned. "Mercy is good," she said, "but hunger doesn't thank it." "Neither does guilt," he answered. She studied him quietly, as though weighing which burden he carried more of. That night, the fire burned low. Mei Lian's baby stirred in sleep, crying softly. Silas knelt beside her before she could rise, gently rocking the child. "You've done this before," she whispered. "Long time ago." His gaze drifted toward the corner of the room, where a cradle once stood before he'd burned it to stop remembering. "Once was enough," he murmured. The words hung between them, heavy with something that wasn't sorrow anymore but recognition. Mei Lian reached out and touched his sleeve, just a brush of her fingers, light as snow. It was enough to make the air tremble. The next morning brought sunlight sharp as glass. The valley glittered, pure and deceiving. Silas stepped outside to check the fences and found fresh tracks leading from the road, 3 sets of boots, too recent to belong to travelers passing through. He followed them halfway down the ridge before they vanished in the drifts. When he returned, his face was hard, his silence heavier. Atsalee caught his look and understood. "They're watching," she said. "Let them." But her hand rested on the knife again. That evening, as the wind rose, Mei Lian placed her baby near the fire and began to boil rice. Silas helped her lift the pot, their hands meeting briefly on the handle. His skin burned at the touch. "You shouldn't do so much," he said. "You need rest." She shook her head. "When I work, I forget hunger." Then, after a pause, "When I see you work, I forget fear." He met her gaze, startled by the quiet power of her words. Before he could reply, a gust rattled the windows, shaking loose a handful of snow from the roof. They all looked up. The babies began to cry at once, sensing the shift in the air. Silas went to the door, opened it slightly. The wind howled through the crack, carrying faint echoes, laughter, male voices somewhere beyond the ridge. He couldn't see anyone, only the shimmer of torchlight too far to be a trick of moon. He shut the door, bolted it, and turned to the women. "Stay close to the fire," he said. Atsalee stood, eyes narrowed. "It begins," she murmured. Mei Lian clutched her child tighter, lips trembling. Silas poured powder into the rifle's chamber and set it by the door. "They want fear," he said quietly. "Let's not give it to them." Outside, the laughter faded into wind. Inside, silence returned, but not the peaceful kind. It was the silence that comes before a storm remembers your name. They came at noon, when the snow had turned to glass and the air hung still as judgment. The dogs barked first, short, sharp warnings that sliced through the valley's quiet. Silas Ward stepped from the barn, wiping sawdust from his hands, and saw 5 riders cresting the ridge. Their coats were dark against the blinding white, rifles slung low, hats pulled down to hide the faces he already knew. Rattler Creek men, neighbors once, now strangers carved by fear. Mei Lian appeared at the cabin door, her baby pressed to her chest. Atsalee stood behind her, a shadow of strength, her jaw tight. Silas lifted a hand. "Stay inside." His voice was calm, but the pulse in his neck beat like a hammer. The riders drew close. At their front rode Sheriff Boone, his expression carved from stone. Behind him, Mrs. Ardell sat in a wagon wrapped in furs, her mouth pursed like she was tasting vinegar. The others, 3 ranchers, watched Silas with that cruel kind of certainty men get when they've convinced themselves they're right. Boone reined in his horse. "Silas," he said quietly, "you know why we're here." "I can guess. You're harboring outsiders, 1 Apache, 1 China woman. Town council says they're to be removed before trouble follows. Word is, there's been theft in the valley. Can't have strangers stirring unrest." Silas's jaw flexed. "They stole nothing but breath. They're just trying to live." Mrs. Ardell spat into the snow. "Live? Look at 'em. Savage blood and heathen prayers. That's not living, it's corruption." Boone shot her a warning glance but didn't disagree. He looked back at Silas, voice softening. Don't make this harder than it's got to be. Let them go peaceful. You know the law. I know decency, Silas said, stepping forward. And it don't wear a badge. The ranchers shifted uneasily, hands on their rifles. Atsalee stepped out then, slow and silent, the baby's blanket clutched tight around her shoulders. She looked straight at Boone. We have done no wrong, she said. We will leave when snow melts and baby's strong. Not before. Boone sighed. Ma'am, it ain't up to me. Then it's up to who? Silas asked. Her. He nodded toward Mrs. Ardell. You let gossip write law now? Mrs. Ardell's cheeks flushed red. You think we'll stand by while filth sleeps under your roof? My husband died fightin' Apaches. Then he died fightin' men, not mothers, Silas cut in. The words hit the air like the crack of a whip. For a moment, nobody moved. Then one rancher urged his horse forward, grabbing at Atsalee's arm. The motion was fast, rough. She pulled back, eyes flashing, and the baby in her wrap began to cry. Mei Lien gasped, rushing out to her side. Silas moved faster than thought. His hand caught the rancher's wrist, twisting until bone met air. The man howled, dropping his rifle into the snow. Boone shouted, Enough! And drew his revolver, but Silas didn't flinch. You'll lower that gun, Boone, Silas said quietly, or you'll have to live with the sound of it going off inside your conscience. The sheriff hesitated, the cold wind snapping between them. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then Boone holstered his weapon, jaw tight with regret. You're digging your own grave, Silas, he muttered. Maybe, Silas said, stepping back, but at least I'll know who I buried beside me. Mrs. Ardell turned away, disgust curling her mouth. You'll regret this kindness, Ward. The town won't forgive it. Silas didn't answer. Behind him, Mei Lien's hands trembled as she held her child, eyes darting from the men to Silas's face. He looked at her briefly, a silent promise passing between them, something steadier than fear. Boone signaled the riders to turn. Let's go, he said. But before they left, he added under his breath, I can't protect you from what comes next. When the sound of hooves finally faded, silence filled the valley again. Only the wind moved, gentle now, as if tired of carrying hate. Silas turned toward the cabin. His knuckles were bleeding. Mei Lien stepped forward, reaching for his hand, then stopped herself halfway. Instead, she tore a strip from her sleeve and bound it around his wrist. They will come again, she whispered. I know, he said. Next time, I'll be ready. Atsalee stood at the porch, her face half lit by the fire behind her. You stood like mountain, she said. But even mountains break if storms keep coming. Silas nodded, glancing toward the dark hills. Then let's pray the storm finds mercy. But even as he said it, the first flakes began to fall again, slow and steady, like ash from a fire that hadn't finished burning. Inside, the babies had gone quiet, sleeping unaware of the world's cruelty. Silas walked to the hearth and sat beside them. Mei Lien poured water into a tin cup, her movements careful, reverent. The fire painted her in shades of gold and sorrow. He spoke without looking up. When I was a boy, my mother used to say the Lord tests a man not by how he fights, but by what he refuses to surrender. Maybe this is that test. Mei Lien looked at him, eyes shining with tears she wouldn't shed. Then you already pass, she said softly. Outside, a coyote called through the night, its cry stretching thin across the snowfields. Silas rose, checked the rifle by the door, and watched the faint orange glow still hanging over the distant town. Something in him understood it wasn't over. The real storm was on its way, and it wouldn't come from the sky this time. The storm broke just after midnight. It came not as thunder, but as fire, the kind that roared with a human voice. Silas Ward woke to the sound of horses and shouts tearing through the wind. By the time he reached the window, he saw the glow, his barn burning bright against the black sky, sparks twisting like wild spirits into the snow. The smell of smoke rolled through the valley, sharp and merciless. He grabbed the rifle by the door. "Stay inside," he ordered, but Mei Lian was already up, clutching her child. Atsalee stood beside her, eyes wide, knife flashing in her hand like a sliver of moon. "They came for us," she said, her voice calm, fatalistic. Silas didn't answer. He threw open the door, and cold air punched the warmth out of the cabin. Flames clawed higher, devouring the barn roof. The horses screamed. He ran toward them through knee-deep snow, lungs searing, the rifle heavy but useless in his arms. Behind him, Mei Lian's voice carried through the wind, calling his name once, then twice, soft but trembling. He didn't turn. 3 figures circled the fire, their faces lit by orange halos. One of them, Garth Hensley, a man Silas had once drunk with, threw another torch into the hay. "That's what you get for turning your place into a refuge for heathens," he shouted. Silas raised the rifle. His words cut through the smoke. "Walk away, Garth. But hatred makes men deaf." Another torch arced through the air, landing near the horses' pen. The wood cracked. The animals thrashed against their stalls. Silas fired once into the snow between them, a warning that hissed like iron through water. "Next one goes through you," he said. They hesitated, 3 shadows flickering uncertain, but Mrs. Ardell's voice rose from behind them, shrill and venomous. "You'll burn with them," Silas warned. "The whole valley knows what you've done." Then something moved behind Silas. Mei Lian had come anyway, her baby swaddled tight against her chest. "Please," she cried to the men. "No more. We leave tomorrow. Just let us go." Her words should have been enough. They weren't. One of the men stepped forward, shoving her back. The child cried out. Mei Lian stumbled. Silas swung the rifle like an axe, striking the man square in the jaw. The sound was sickening, bone against wood. The man fell into the snow, groaning. Atsalee appeared from the darkness, moving like a storm given shape. She struck the remaining rider with her knife handle, hard and fast, sending him reeling. Firelight caught her face, eyes blazing, mouth set in a line of fury and grace. The third man dropped his torch and ran, shouting for help. Boone arrived minutes later with 2 deputies, their horses panting clouds of steam. He took one look at the burning barn, at Silas standing in front of the 2 women, and cursed under his breath. "God Almighty, Silas! What have you done?" "What I had to," Silas said. Smoke stained his face, his coat torn at the sleeve. "They came to destroy what's mine." Boone dismounted, eyes scanning the wreckage. "You can't keep fighting the whole town." "Maybe I'm not the one fighting anymore," Silas replied. Behind them, Mei Lian sank to her knees in the snow, rocking her crying baby. The fire cast her in trembling gold, her tears shining like glass. Silas knelt beside her. "It's over," he whispered, though they both knew it wasn't. She looked at him then, really looked, and in her gaze was something that silenced the chaos, the beginning of belief. Atsalee stepped forward, knife still wet with snow. "The barn is gone," she said softly. "But we are not." Boone's deputies dragged the fallen men to their horses. Mrs. Ardell was nowhere to be seen, swallowed by the dark. Boone hesitated, watching Silas. "I'll tell the town it was lightning," he said finally. "But they won't forgive. They'll just wait until you're tired." Silas nodded. "Then I won't get tired." By dawn, the fire had eaten itself out. The land smelled of ash and wet earth. Silas stood by what was left of the barn, a black skeleton against a pale horizon. Mei Lian came beside him, her baby asleep now, wrapped in a shawl that smelled of smoke and milk. "You saved us," she said quietly. He shook his head. "No, you saved me first." They stood in silence. Wind combed through the grass, carrying the faintest warmth of sunrise. For the first time in years, Silas felt the ache in his chest ease, not vanish, but soften into something human. Inside the cabin, Atsalee packed what little they owned. She glanced at them through the window and smiled faintly, something proud and sorrowful. "He belongs to this valley," she murmured to herself. "And maybe she does now too." That afternoon, Boone returned alone. He handed Silas a folded paper. "Town council wants you gone by spring," he said. "But between you and me, I think the land already picked its side." Silas looked down at the paper, then tossed it into the fire. "This land's seen worse men stay." Boone nodded once, mounted up, and rode off without another word. The days that followed were quiet. They rebuilt what they could, a small pen, a new roof over the animals that survived. Snow melted into muddy rivers, feeding the valley again. Mei Lien planted the first seeds near the porch. Silas watched her kneel in the dirt, sleeves rolled to her elbows, her laughter mingling with the sound of the babies cooing nearby. For a moment, he could almost believe in redemption. That evening, as twilight pooled along the ridges, Silas carried 2 mugs of coffee to the porch. Mei Lien sat there with her child asleep in her lap, hair loose and silvered by dusk. "I never thanked you," she said softly. "You don't owe me thanks," he replied. She looked out over the valley. "No, but I owe you a home." He followed her gaze, the burned barn, the patched fences, the endless horizon bruised with fading gold. Somehow, it looked whole again. He turned to her, voice low. "Then maybe this home chose us both." She smiled, and for the first time, her smile reached her eyes. Atsalee joined them on the steps, her baby asleep against her chest. "The mountain is watching," she said. "It knows who belongs." Silas looked toward the peaks, their tips burning in the last light of day. "Then let it watch," he murmured. "We've got nothing left to hide." The wind rose again, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and ash, the smell of survival. Inside, the fire crackled, a quiet reminder that warmth can be built from ruin. Mei Lien leaned her head against Silas's shoulder. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. From far off, the first stars appeared, cold, sharp, eternal, and the valley below shimmered like forgiveness finally found its place to rest. And maybe that's the secret the Old West keeps to itself. That home isn't a place we build, but the moment we stop running from the love that tries to find us. And if you listen close enough, traveler, you'll hear it still, somewhere in the wind. Now, click the story waiting on your screen, for there's one even warmer than this, and I'll be right here to tell it to you.